right, Mark has a question here. I downloaded and read the article by Troy Martin on Paul's argument from nature for the veil in 1 Corinthians 11:13-15, a testicle instead of a head covering. It raised some interesting questions in terms of arguments from nature in the writings of Paul and how they should be viewed today. Paul was making an argument from nature, but his understanding of nature in this passage would be one that would be rejected today. In some senses, this would likely be true of most any interpretation of the Corinthians passage. Few, I think, would contend that we would be bound to hair length based on an argument based on an ancient understanding of nature. Yet, what would this mean for some of Paul's other arguments from nature? What would this mean for references to nature in Romans 1? I can certainly imagine individuals making the case that if we can see Paul's understanding of what is and isn't natural in 1 Corinthians as culturally relative, that we could do the same with Romans 1. I'm interested in your take on this.
Yeah, in part, the answer to this depends on whether what Paul is using, or whether Paul's language is drawing on science of his day. In other words, is he using quote unquote scientific knowledge of his day to make a point, as opposed to sort of just referencing nature in general ways like we do today, sort of the nature as we experience it in the course of life or through our senses or whatnot. In other words, not talking about something being quote unquote natural from a scientific standpoint, but just sort of in general experience. So that's part of what we'd have to think about to parse what the questioner is asking. It's actually really a good question. Let me just try to illustrate, I think, what might be sort of lurking behind this question. If the question is sort of referencing the homosexuality issue, then Paul's argument from nature is tied to his view, which is derived from the Old Testament. Again, not a scientific treatise written by a Greco-Roman guy or any other guy. Paul's argument from nature is tied to his view from the Old Testament of why God ultimately created male and female, gender, and why he created sex. In other words, Paul's argument from nature is about creation order. Again, this phrase we throw around a lot, creation order. Male and female gender and sexual intercourse were designed to produce life, not only give pleasure. So sexual intercourse, which dispenses with the production of life, i.e. homosexual intercourse, was viewed as contrary to the creation order. And guess what? It is, because it doesn't produce life. So God's gift of sex in biblical thinking isn't merely to pleasure ourselves or pleasure somebody else. The fabric of creation includes it, intends it to perpetuate life, not merely experience gratification. So you have to be thinking about how Paul, again, referencing the Old Testament, not a science treatise by Hippocrates or something. He's getting his perspective here on what is normal order, what is natural order, what is creation order, from the fact that God created male and female and told them to be fruitful and multiply. This is the purpose of gender. This, and in Paul's life experience of nature, this is going to be what he experiences. People and animals have babies. This is how life is perpetuated. This is, again, very normative for creation order. Now, what I should also say, what I'm not saying sex is only for procreation. That's sort of an old Catholic ethic. Sex is also for pleasure. I think Paul's very clear on that in 1 Corinthians 7 about, it's better to marry than to burn kind of thing. He understands and he knows, of course, by, just life experience, that this is what a marriage is for, to satisfy this innate desire, this normal creation desire, which in Paul's mind, again, is an impulse, not just for gratification. It's an impulse designed by the Creator to produce life. Paul says, look, it's hard to, fight against that. So it's better to marry than to burn with desire and all that sort of thing. So It legitimizes the fact that there is desire. Paul goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 7 that when you're married, your wife's body belongs to you and your body belongs to your wife. So you get this gratification element in God's purpose for sex, but it's not the only element. There are two elements, in biblical thinking. So a sexual ethic or practice that doesn't honor both elements is aberrant. That would be the point of again, the whole creation order logic. Now, there are some people who say, well, there's homosexual behavior in the animal kingdom. Yeah, there is, but that is also contrary to nature for a simple reason. A species for which homosexuality would be the norm would now be extinct. In other words, you must have both elements to honor creation order. Yes, animals do exhibit homosexual behavior. You have certain species that can actually change gender. Why? Because they need to reproduce. They need to produce life. Again, that is not the norm. Those are the exceptions that sort of prove the rule. They are exceptions. They're not normative. They are exceptions. Again, and we can, people would want to talk about whether that's the result of the fall. To me, that's kind of a pointless discussion. You don't need to speculate in those areas just to affirm what is normal, creation order as opposed to what isn't the norm. And, when in Paul's experience, again, they don't have the advantage of he didn't have a PhD in zoology and all that kind of stuff. When he's arguing from creation or from nature, this is what he's getting at when it comes to sexual morality and sexual behavior. It's not just for gratification. It's not about you or it's not about your partner. Yes, God wants you to be fulfilled and gratified. He understands that. But ultimately, this drive is wrapped up into, it's intimately tied to the production of life. And so in the ancient world, just generally, this isn't just with biblical thinking, just generally, even other cultures that look down upon homosexual behavior, for instance, part of the rationale was that it doesn't produce life. And in fact, it produces death. And I'm not referring to some, again, vague, abstract argument about HIV or something like that. That's not what I'm talking about. They believed that the man deposited, the life form. He deposited the seed in the woman and then it grew. Think of the plant metaphor. We talked about a lot of this when we did Leviticus, by the way. But there was this planting metaphor idea that when a man ejaculated into the woman, he deposited offspring, seed. This is why the terms are the same in Hebrew and Greek and whatnot. He deposited the living thing, the whole living thing, into the woman, and then therefore it would grow in the woman and then be birthed out. So that when you didn't get kids, the ancients had no conception of male infertility. It was always a female problem. There's something wrong with the garden. I planted the seed and it's just not growing. There's something wrong with you. Well, if you think this, then in terms of homosexuality, not only is it not consistent with creation order, again, why God created gender and sex and all this stuff, for two reasons: pleasure and the production of life. Not only is it not consistent with that, but you would, in a homosexual relationship, you would be essentially not only, quote unquote, to use a biblical phrase or a King James phrase, wasting the seed, but you would actually be killing the offspring because they have no place to grow because your partner's not a woman. And that would have been viewed as something awful. So, yeah, not all of that obviously matches up with our scientific knowledge of where babies come from and whatnot. But the part that sort of transcends that is just a sort of a general statement is, why do we even have sex to begin with? And the answer is, again, gratification and the production of life. And you need both of those to be in place for, in Paul's mind, for a normative sexual relationship according to the norms of creation order to be intact. And when both of those things are intact, then God is happy because that's the way he made things to work. Again, this is the kind of approach, these are the mental trajectories and the theological trajectories that would go into something like that. So there is I think that is at the heart. If the question is really about homosexuality, that's at the heart of it. Paul's not offering an incorrect scientific assertion. That's not the basis of his argument against homosexuality. The basis of his argument against homosexuality is that it doesn't conform to creation order. And again, if you want a little bit more on this and some sources for it, you could go back and listen to the Leviticus episode that we did in those chapters of Leviticus that deal with sexual norms. And there's more to it. There's inheritance issues, there's property issues that deal with certain facets of Old Testament law as it relates to sexual relationships. But I think that's probably adequate for here.